Welcome to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy, where we explore the scriptural and theological and now historical case for plural marriage. As always, please listen to these episodes from the beginning so you can hear those most important discussions and then continue on from there. In this episode, we are continuing our investigation into Joseph's polygamy. I am pleased to be able to interview Mark Tensmeyer, who has been become one of the foremost experts on proving Joseph's polygamy. So he really gets into the historical minutia that can show us the evidence, the strongest evidence that there is. So it's good, again, to bring all of the discussions to the forefront so we can really dig in and get the best information to make the most solid case. So I hope you enjoy this interview. It's a little bit difficult at times. Mark's kind of an interesting guy, but I think it is very worthwhile. So thank you for joining us as we take this deep dive into the murky waters of Joseph's polygamy. Welcome to 132 Problems. I am so excited to bring this episode to you today. So I have a guest, Mark Tensmeyer, and I'm really thankful that he agreed to come and talk to me. So just a little bit of history. Well, I should do a brief introduction, which I'll get to, and you can help me with that, Mark. But okay. Mark was in that initial Facebook group that I've talked about so often that I started so we could start discussing polygamy when I started to have the earth-shattering realization that polygamy wasn't of God. Okay, so he's been on this topic for a long time as well, but I think that you've gone much more in depth in the Joseph's polygamy issue. I've been more concerned with the scriptural case of polygamy, so anyway, Mark recently was on a debate on Hemlock knots, where he was arguing for the evidence being solid that Joseph was the originator of polygamy. And so I'm really glad that he came on to talk to me, because I'm realizing there are sort of different specialties. Like Brian Hales and Todd Compton they're in the field of researching polygamy, but they're not in the specialty of evidence of Joseph's polygamy. They're not really as prepared for that argument as Mark is. So I wanted him to come on, and we won't be able to get into even a fraction of what he knows. He knows so much. So we're just going to... Well, that's been my impression. So anyway, but we'll talk about it and just see where the conversation goes, because I want us to have what helped me really understand polygamy and the scriptural case for it was engaging with the best polygamous scriptorians. And so that's what I'm hoping to do here as well. So just a quick introduction. Mark, I believe you practice law in Texas. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And I looked at your bio, and that was fun. My son is in his second year of school at Florida State, and you, I think, he's at the University of Florida, and you were at Florida State. Yeah. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
And so, so that was a fun connection. So anyway, so Mark's bringing his legal mind to this topic, and I'm curious to know, well, and you can tell me a little about your family and about yourself, because I actually don't know that much about you other than that you're really good at this topic.
Well, yeah, so I'm married, and I have two little girls.
Very fun.
Yeah, I have one that's 8, another one that's toddler age right now. So
you're busy, and we're keeping you up late at night. This is the only time we could get together.
Yeah, that's been so there's that. You want to know a little bit of the background about how I got
That's what I wanted to go to. Yeah, now I know you went to BYU, Idaho, and so I assume, not that even if it's not okay if I ask, let me know, but are you an active member of the LDS Church?
Absolutely.
Okay, so you're a traditional believer in the LDS Church, and okay, that's great. That's great. And then
about it,
what did you say? I'm sorry.
I consider myself pretty normal. In terms of,
that's great. And so I do want to know what got you interested in polygamy, because I think you joined the Facebook group after you had already been researching the topic.
Yeah, I did. So, church history has always been an interest of mine. My grandparents were the directors of the church's visitor center and all the operations there of Nauvoo in the 90s as part of their mission. And so, when I was 8, 9 years old, I went to all those places. I loved it. I ate it up. And I always had been, especially during my mission, after my mission, got into it. That's when I read a lot of books and things. And I think it was about 2014. It was when I was finishing law school. Well, when I finished law school, I was studying for the bar exam. And when I was expecting our first child, when we were expecting our first child, and so it was a real transition point in my life. And I was just, at that stage, you go in, I was looking for something a hobby or something that I could do that I enjoyed, that I was good at, but that I could also do on the fly with kids and with work and things like that, like a lot of people did. And one of the things I really got interested in was researching other um, branches of the restoration. So, like I said, I had experience with Nauvoo, and if you go to church history sites, that's a lot of church members' first exposure to there being other branches of Mormon, right? I mean, there's the Community of Christ operations in Nauvoo, and then in Independence, and then of course there's also Hedrickites that own or the Church of Christ Simple that own the temple slot. And also my mission in Montana and Wyoming, first couple areas, there were first area I had was Lovell, Wyoming. Second area was the Bitterroot Valley in Montana. And both of those areas are areas that have communities of the Apostolic United Brethren.
Oh, okay. So for anyone that doesn't
Yeah,
know, the AUB is one of the polygamous sects. There's the
yeah,
FLDS and the AUB.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Hmm.
And so I had a lot of exposure to that, and just through other contacts and things that I had. So I really got interested into it. And so I stumbled on a friend recommended a Facebook group that I had, and that was about discussions between different groups. And and I got into that. I'm now an admin of that group and have been for a while. Um,
Is
and
that group still
Yeah,
going?
yeah, it is. It's a Restoration
Okay.
Exploration Forum. I co-admin it with a guy who's a Community of Christ member.
Oh, that sounds really cool.
Actually
Okay.
disagrees with me about this issue. Um,
Okay. I just barely recorded my episode on the RLDS and Community of Christ transition. So I'm more familiar with that than I would have been.
Oh,
So
really? Oh, we could talk
yeah.
about some of that. Yeah. I was going to send you some of the Paul Hansen letters maybe to read, but then I never got around
Oh,
to
I'd
it.
love that.
Yeah,
Okay.
the Paul Hansen letters. It's really great stuff that he came up with and stuff that he found. Yeah, so that's when I really got into it. And there was a lot of discussion about just various issues. And so that's when I really got into really got into academic history. And so I'd read journal articles, I'd read academic books. And I got real good at finding primary sources. In this day and age, you can find primary sources are pretty accessible to just the everyday person. And
Which is
how to
such a
weigh
blessing. It's so much easier.
and how to weigh and how to balance evidence. And so there's issues like the role of the Quorum of the 12. There's the ordination of Joseph Smith III as his father's successor. There's a lot of these things, and there's facts, and then there's implications of facts. Like, what are those facts
Well, and
mean?
quick question. So Joseph Smith III, I know that was in a Mark Hoffman forgery. Is there a valid source of Joseph Smith III
Not
being
contemporary.
ordained?
Not contemporary. No.
Okay. Okay.
Not contemporary, but I think the earliest source we have, Jacob Pedrine did a video on that very recently
Okay.
that I highly recommend. He actually came up with a lot of
I'm
stuff that
hoping he'll come on and talk
influences
to me as
issues.
well.
Yeah.
He's
Oh yeah,
okay.
he's good. Yeah, as you know, I've worked with him a lot on this. Um,
Yeah.
so
Okay. So you got started getting into this issue
yeah,
through your connection to other
yeah,
branches of
and
the art of the
yeah,
restoration
yeah, and I
tradition.
wanted to
Okay.
do that because I wanted to get into just like, well, what are facts on these certain things? Because I mean, we can discuss interpretations of scripture, and there's always going to be different interpretations of scripture. There's always going to be spiritual experience that's going to be different. But what are facts? I mean, there are things that did or did not happen. And so the issue of Joseph Smith's polygamy came up. This is in 2014. So this is before a lot of the interest in I guess, your disaffected Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints members took into it.
Hmm.
So this is just before Denver Snuffer was excommunicated. This is just before a lot of that happened. That was all happening at this time.
Okay. So John DeLynne's podcast was going. So all of this momentum was
Yeah, yeah,
building.
yeah. And
Yep.
yeah, I don't know if we want to get too much into this. I think it was Rock Waterman, I think, was the first one to really bring the attention
Yeah, he
I
wrote his
guess,
article.
yeah, he wrote his
Yep.
blog post on that. I think that was in 2009, 2010. I don't know. So that
I'm
was before I
guessing
read
that
it. But
that's one of the things my husband read that made him go, "Oh, polygamy isn't," and that's what brought my
yeah,
attention to it because I
yeah,
was
and
like,
so he did, and then
"Yeah,
yeah, there was yeah, but really before all of that happened, I was discussing this um, with uh, with conservative Community of Christ members, which there are some, by the way.
oh, there still are. Okay,
Yeah,
they haven't gone
they
to the
absolutely there
restoration
absolutely are.
branches. They're okay.
Yeah, yeah, and then
That's
restoration.
dedication to stick with it. That's that to stick with
Oh
the main
no,
body
no,
of the church.
my
That was hard.
co-admin on there. He's a really neat guy. He's a gentleman that's he's a quasi conservative. He believes very much in the current day church's mission and agenda. Things like things LGBT inclusion, ordination of women, the emphasis on things like service rather than I don't know, conversion of people. But he still has a very much conservative view on the foundational aspects of the restoration and things like
Okay,
that. And
okay.
so
So
it's really
he
so
went
it's
with the theological changes, but not the historical changes. That makes sense.
that's
Okay.
correct, yeah. And so that's why so that's when I really got into and I started researching a lot of this stuff. And so when a lot of these things came out, there was Denver Snuffers talk. Then there was Leo Everett's paper that came out at about the same
See,
time.
I'm not up on all of this. So
Yeah, yeah,
I think I know about Denver Snuffers talk. I don't know if I've
yeah,
heard it, but I don't know the second thing you said. So, and these were
yeah. There's
all
Denver Snuffers,
specifically
and then
about
all these things.
Joseph's polygamy.
Yeah, so that's when I really got into that. That was a topic that I got into because I like researching this because it's one that ostensibly at least is objective, right? I mean, it's a fact that it was something that did or did not happen. And I got into looking at the sources, and I enjoy that kind of thing, weighing and balance, and learning just the method of history and how all that works. And so, and I think I got it was almost reluctant too that I got into it too because it was almost like nobody was really responding to all this stuff that was happening. There really wasn't.
What do you mean? Or you mean you were writing papers and you couldn't get
Oh
much
yeah, well I
response?
mean it didn't seem like there were that many people that had like read Leo's paper that disagreed with him. That
Okay.
really got into the things like that. And so
So I don't know what's Leo's paper. Like
okay, Leo's
maybe you could
paper. He
send it to
wrote
me
it
and I'll post the
anonymously.
link.
Um,
Oh, is it Joseph Smith's
Miss
monogamy? Is it
Monogamy.
that one?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
okay, okay. All right. Okay.
yeah. It was yeah. I mean, he was in the
All
debate
right.
opposite of me. That was one of the main reasons I did the debate was because Leo was one of the guys opposite. And so yeah,
Okay.
and so there were a lot of these groups that were popping up, like yours, and there just wasn't a lot. There were a lot of people that were discussing the topic, and there were people who were kind of were against it, right? I mean, people said it was wrong, but not a lot of people that were really explaining the reasons and getting into the evidence as to why. And I thought it was an interesting topic, so that's really why I got into it. And especially there were a lot of people that were kind of in the middle that would say, I read this paper, I read this, and it seems kind of compelling, and I don't really know how to answer it. And they weren't really finding anything, and so
You
um,
stepped into the breach. Okay, so can I ask you a couple of questions that just to kind of set,
yeah, yeah,
establish where we are?
yeah,
So,
do it.
so I guess my first question is, when you were coming to this research, I assume you were coming to it from the standpoint of believing both in polygamy as well as Joseph Smith's polygamy. So I'm kind of curious to know your thoughts on polygamy. Do you know what I mean? Like
My
members of the
thoughts on
church can be in
polygamy.
all different places. Like, do you agree with the church
Oh, you
narrative
mean
that God did
like on a
command it?
theological moral level?
Just in terms of, did God establish polygamy and then it needed to be taken away? Like just kind of how do you view
Yeah,
polygamy in?
I think of it as that. I mean, I think that it is a principle that that has been commanded at times and taken away at times. I don't think that it's necessarily always been practiced in the right way. I think it's something that I definitely wouldn't want to do myself. And it's one of those questions where I'll really debate the morality of it if I'm if it's ever a case where I actually have to do it. I mean, I don't I don't doubt the many experiences that the saints who did practice it had. I mean, I was really surprised on my mission. Like I said, I had exposure to people in the AEB. I was surprised by how many women it were that brought their families into it. I mean, the idea of the idea of all the of polygamous women being just very, I don't know, being victimized about it all. That I don't. That's not been my experience. The exposure I've had to it.
I
Um,
think there's definitely a broad swath. There are
there
very
really is,
strong
and
women
so
in
I mean, I
polygamy,
don't.
and there are definitely very. It depends on the
So
personality and the choice, the amount of choice they have in it. I think.
I mean, it's something that I don't claim to have a big understanding on. It's not something that I've really, honestly, haven't invested a whole lot of thought in. It's a whole lot of thought and soul into it
Okay.
because I haven't really felt like I've had to. I mean, I
Okay.
feel like
So
I can accept that the saints that did practice it commanded you that they believed it, and that's good enough for me.
okay. So your focus has been entirely on, or almost entirely on, the historical case and the,
Yeah,
what
I mean,
Joseph
which is to say
did,
that
not the.
the ethical questions and stuff are things that I haven't thought about, haven't worried about. I mean, do this research, I made the connection. Nancy Mariah Winchester is my great grandmother. So
Okay.
she's she was a 14-year-old that Joseph married. I put her probably on like a tier two in terms of evidence supporting that marriage actually happening. But
Okay.
so I mean that's so yeah, so it is a topic that does mean something to me. But you're right. I mean, my main focus has been on the history of it.
Okay. And
I
for me,
mean,
I'm not even, for me, I don't focus on the morality and ethics. I mean, I do, but my main focus was on the scriptures and the theology. Like,
on the theology behind it, yeah.
and the scriptures, like when you said that, that God commands it at times. I'm curious to know if you are, do you have a time in mind that God commanded it? Like just off the top of your head, do you?
Oh, sure, yeah. When the Saints and Nauvoo did it, when Joseph
Okay.
Smith did
So,
it, yeah.
okay. So then, but any scriptural time that's connected to, like, do you think that God commanded Abraham and commanded, um, I'm just curious if you haven't thought about these things, it's okay. And then
I think possibly, yeah, but I mean, not necessarily.
okay.
I mean, I think
And
you'd have a really hard time making the case that the Old Testament does not permit depicts God as being against polygamy. I mean, I think there's a lot of verses in there. There's a lot of people that do it pretty openly, but at the same time, that it's a sacramental thing, the Old Testament doesn't really make that case either.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
don't want to challenge you too much. You'd have a hard time
yeah. I
making
know a
a
lot, and I know
case
there are people
against
that disagree with that and say that,
slavery or
yeah.
prostitution or genocide, or so it
Yeah.
gets pretty deep
Well,
into
and
the
I mean, in
weeds. But
the same time, the same case too. I mean, that like God of the Old Testament doesn't really, he's not really against slavery either, as he depicts it that
right,
something. And so, does that make
and
it
we did it.
right? Does that make it right? I mean, that's a good question too. But
Right.
uh,
Okay. And so, is your assumption that that polygamy will be in Zion and in the celestial kingdom?
not necessarily. Um,
Okay. So, with your
I don't
studying,
think
have
that
you?
I don't believe that it's that it's going to be like a necessary thing that those that are polygamists are going to be in some sort of higher tier in the celestial kingdom or anything like that. I don't believe that necessarily. Again, you can ask Jacob. He's found a lot of good material on that from like Brigham Young or John Taylor that support that too. So not necessarily like that. Not
Oh
even.
no. So have you? So you're okay disagreeing with Brigham Young on and John Taylor and Orson Pratt and and Heber C.
Well,
Kimball, and you're okay to say, yeah, they got that wrong.
sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
But then
So
again, I mean, I also know not to be too sure in my own opinion about anything. So
okay.
I mean, that's
Okay.
just kind of where I'm at with it now. So I mean,
Yeah, I appreciate that because that's been my main focus. So I like to know kind of where you're
yeah,
coming from
sure,
because
yeah.
I always find it interesting that that we kind of have this position of they were right about polygamy, but they were wrong about all the details of polygamy. If that makes
Yeah,
sense, like they
and
didn't live it
I think
well. They
that's
preached
good
it.
too. I mean, Master Lyman even said that at one point. He says is like we had it when it came out. We implemented it a certain way, but certain people just fell into wayward stuff and were wrong about it. the way we were doing. I mean, even Deuteronomy 7 section 132 itself says there's stuff that Joseph needed to repent of, and how he implemented it, and how he did it. I mean,
Okay, okay.
so
Well, and
even
if you know
that,
much about the life of Brigham Young and a lot of our ancestors, I'm still asking anyone to give me any example of who did live it well. You know, what families there are that polygamy resulted in more happiness as a general rule than in
yeah,
more
and
suffering.
that's hard to do. It's and again, that's counterfactual history. How do you know how happy they would have been had they not done it? I mean, that's
Right. Right, but we can compare things like if it was for the purpose of which I think is a twisting of the scriptures, but to say that it's to raise up seed, which we interpret to mean have more children, and we know that polygamist women had less children, had fewer children. You know, so we can
yeah,
look at a lot of
yeah. I
factual
mean,
things,
there's
and we can compare divorce rates in polygamy versus non-polygamy. We can look at a lot of things to see, you know,
yeah.
to just kind of get. So it does get there are some
That
objective
is a
things
whole
we can look
discussion
at
there.
as
It's
well as the
yeah.
histories. So anyway, so okay, sorry, and I told you I go off. So that it's good to set up. Thank you for sharing. So okay, so do you care if I ask you some questions first, and then I'd like to because I
Yeah,
really
go
want you
ahead.
to be able to
Ask
present.
questions. Yeah.
Okay,
Go ahead.
so my next question is because you know this discussion is so difficult because the evidence is it's a long time ago. The evidence is scant. There's
Mhm.
you know it's hard. So what I'm curious is what would convince you that Joseph wasn't a polygamist? What would it take to make you believe that he wasn't?
Well, one of the big issues with trying to say he wasn't is that the evidence comes from a lot of different places. So if it really was the case that all the evidence, all the contemporary evidence came from anti-sources, or specifically like anti-sources that were in collusion together, that would be one thing.
And so we know
Uh,
that's not going to happen. So
right.
okay,
Or if it really was the case that all the testimonials about Joseph Smith being a polygamist came just from Utah Mormonism, then that would be one thing, but that's not the case. And so I think it would be it would be very, very difficult to do. I really don't even know how it would be done. Because I mean, one of the big things as we talked about is, you know, if even in theory for the body of evidence we have coming out of Utah to exist, for it to not be true, there'd have to be a very organized, very expansive, very deliberate conspiracy involved. But even if that did exist, I don't think it would account for all the evidence. I don't think it would account for all the sources, and there would have to be another good explanation for how Mormon polygamy came about like it did. And I really, it's tough. I really don't know what that would consist of, what it would have to be.
okay. So
I think I
there's
would have to really change my worldview and how I look at how evidence works. I think would have to be the biggest thing.
Okay. So there's no piece of evidence that could come forward that could be like for me, and I know that, you know, this for me, if the evidence had come forward differently and we knew that Joseph Smith had a child, like it would just take one child to be like, okay, done, it's over. You know, like there's a really easy way to disprove the Joseph wasn't a polygamist side. And so
well, I
I'm
mean,
wondering if there's
but what if?
any evidence.
Well, but that's a good
If
question. What
Joseph
if
had a
like
child, if Joseph had a child with someone other than Emma, that would be like, okay, done.
Well,
He
it
had,
might for you. It might for you. I don't know about you, but I think by and large, even if we had DNA evidence of a child being birthed, I don't think it would. I don't think this whole movement about him not being a polygamist would go away. I mean, think about it. I mean, there's a huge movement that just with Thomas Jefferson, for example. There's a whole movement about him having a child with this slave house, Sally Hemings. There is a whole group of people that don't believe that, and yet we have DNA evidence of that. In
well,
fact,
isn't it because it could have been his brother? So you're saying the same thing could happen with, because I've
why
heard
wouldn't that
people make the
argument
case
why
that,
wouldn't that argument work? I mean,
okay,
his uncle John, his there's all kinds of counter arguments that
so
would
it depends
rise.
on how good the DNA evidence would be.
Well,
Okay,
if it's Y
that makes
chromosome
sense.
with DNA evidence, I mean, it could just as easily be his uncle John Smith, who was a polygamist in Nauvoo, as was his cousin George A, as
Okay.
was his brother William. there would be, I mean, yeah, there's all kinds of arguments that could
Yeah, but
arise. I mean,
so
I don't
okay,
think there
so
would. Yeah. So I don't
see,
think,
okay,
I
see, I
think this
see
would be
that in this.
regardless. Yeah.
I see that in the same way because we did have very strong claims from people saying this is Joseph's child. And same thing when that's disproved, all of a sudden it's, oh, well, they were having sex with both of their husbands, or they were, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
guess
That's a
there's
whole
no
thing.
way to get to the bottom of it, so okay, so that's interesting to hear. So you're saying on your side though, same thing, there's no evidence that could come forward, like
I
even
don't
if
know
it
what it would
was
be.
revealed.
I think the difference, the disagreement, I don't think it has to do as much with the evidence as is how people view evidence and how people synthesize evidence. I think the difference is the mentality more than it is anything else. More, I think by and large, people that are on the side that say Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist are pretty aware of the evidence. There's some of the what I call the third party evidence that people tend to not be as aware of. You said you researched the RLDS. Did you read the Richard Howard paper?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah. So
That's
there's
what
a lot
my
that's in there. Yeah.
There's what did you say?
Yeah, so there's a lot that's in there. The paper that originally came out was one that had been edited, and it changed how he ended that paper. And the recent issue, the John Whitmer Society, came up with his like original one and his how he originally ended it, which is interesting. But yeah, there's a lot
So
that
is
came
that
out.
paper available? Is the original ending available? Because I didn't find
Yeah,
that.
yeah, it's in I think the most recent issue of the John Whitmer Journal. I got a copy
Great.
because
Okay.
I did a book review that was in it.
So he just kind of altered his conclusions, but he still
He
used the
had to
same
alter his
pieces of
conclusions.
evidence.
He was
Okay.
directed to. There was
Yeah.
that whole story too about that paper. But anyhow,
Yep. Okay. Okay. So that's interesting because, yeah. So for me, so like I said, this hasn't been my topic, but I kind of want to share my
yeah,
perspective on it. So I think, like the question of what would be compelling evidence for Joseph's innocence. It's interesting that it's a foregone conclusion that he was guilty. Where I do feel like, well, first of all, there is no hard evidence of. Guess I shouldn't say guilty. I mean that he was a polygamist or that he was not a polygamist, right? Guilty of polygamy is what I could say.
okay,
But we have zero hard evidence. And anytime you were trying to say, look, we're married, there first of all should be children, especially if the reason for it was to raise up seed. That's one of the main justifications we give for it. And then also, anytime that you're married, it's like what marriage is you have sex and usually have children. We know that Joseph was fertile and all of his wives were fertile. I know that Nauvoo was different, but I'm trying to define what marriage is. You cohabitate almost all of the time. You take your husband's name. You have a marriage license or certificate of some sort that we can track, some sort of a record. You have some sort of a public awareness. You know what I mean? I'm going down the list of anything that would be
okay,
evidence, actual evidence of marriage. Like if I were trying to prove that Brigham Young was a polygamist, I would just have tons of stuff even before 1852. There were already children. There were even before it was out in the open. And so I'm trying to compare that to Joseph's. And I guess I appreciate that you're willing to say that it's not
okay.
a slam dunk discussion, But
Oh, I
then and
never
then
said
anyway, and
that.
then
I
no,
never said that.
I thought you said it wasn't a. I thought you were. Oh, you do think it is a slam dunk.
I think that objectively it's pretty clear. I think that there are questions and I think there are issues that are legitimate. I think people that are coming at it from the side that he wasn't are. I think that there are things that about the narrative that can make that people can look at and say, oh, well, hey, wait a minute, how does this work? But I think that objectively looking at the evidence in totality, yeah, I think it's pretty clear that he was.
Okay, okay,
Yeah,
that's
so
really
that's
interesting. So
yeah, no,
we'll get.
yeah.
Is that based to some extent on? I'm guessing that that's based to some extent on like amount of evidence, the amount of affidavits and claims
Well,
combined with the certain critical pieces of
yeah,
contemporaneous
yeah.
evidence. Is it
Here.
that
Let's
combination?
There's a few things you said. I'm going to back up just a bit. So when we talk about Joseph Smith being a polygamist, like what exactly do we mean by that? Like what is the mainstream
Right.
narrative about that? And so, and you're right. So there's a lot of things like so today. Let's say if we're to say what a marriage exists, there's basically two ways you can do that. You can say that there's a legal marriage because there's been a marriage license and it's been a ceremony and it's been recorded, and so there's an official marriage that way. Like, and the other way to do it is by like a common law marriage. And so to establish a common law marriage, like if you have a lawsuit um, about a common law marriage where you have to establish because somebody wants survivors benefits or rent control or something like that, then you have to show all those things you talked about. Did they cohabitate? Did they hold themselves out as being married? You know, that sort of thing. Did they introduce themselves to relatives as being married? Type of thing. By any estimate, by any view of Joseph Smith's polygamy, that second one, like how it would be to establish, like, say, a common law marriage, those elements would not be there by any estimation, by any way of looking at it. The sources we have on when we say that he was a polygamist, well, he's the founder of polygamy, there's really a few things we mean. Is one, that he would have these ceremonies with these women where they would have a sealing ceremony. Generally, we think for time and for all eternity. It might have been for eternity only. We think that for some of them, they definitely were for time as well. And for most of them, it's like a rom-com or Disney story. Once it gets up to that point, that's where the story ends. Todd Compton says that in front of those things. Like Lucy Walker, there's a big story that she tells about the lead up to it. But then after the ceremony, we know virtually nothing about it, if there was anything after that at all. Now, in some cases, we have sources about there being sexual relations. How much and with how many of the wives, we don't really have a great idea. The other part of Joseph Smith being a polygamist, we know, is that it was a principle that he taught to other people and authorized other people to take on. So we're not saying, so a lot of those things that he cohabitated in the traditional sense, where like they have a home together, there's not really any indication that that's true. And when people say cohabitate, especially in that sense, there's an equivocation. Is that a euphemism for having sexual relations, or does that mean literally that they actually had a home together? There's really not.
Well,
really
I guess
any...
we look at polygamous marriages, and even if the women have their own home, the husband spends time there.
Yeah, I mean, is that the type of thing he did? I mean, we really don't have a lot of reliable sources on that. And so for a lot of, so that's what we mean. So for a lot of those things, and by the way, and whenever I say we have this discussion of Joseph Smith's polygamy, we need to compare like with like, right? I mean, you mentioned we have a lot of those things for Brigham Young, even pre-1852, but that's still 10 years.
Well, 8 years. Oh, you mean 10 years from 1842
when he became a polygamist? That's still 10 years. I mean, Brigham Young is really a polygamist for 3-4 years before he has any children. Willard Richards, he becomes a polygamist in 1843. He doesn't have a child with the poor wife until 1847. So long after Joseph is dead, long after they've left Nauvoo, people's situations were different. So like Brigham Young's household, we really don't even know that much about his household during the Nauvoo period. Like, did Lucy Decker cohabitate with it? We don't know. We know a lot about the Clayton household because William Clayton kept a journal. He talks about it. And his wives were his wife's sisters who lived in their household, and it was easy for them to do. And he goes into embarrassing detail about some of that stuff. That's part of why we love William Clayton and why we kind of have issues with him too, because he's so embarrassingly candid. We have
quite a bit from Heber C. Kimball as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that one. The Kimball household, we know quite a bit about the Kimball household as well because of their letters and things. And so everyone's situation is a little bit different. And so
so go ahead. Sorry.
So that's kind of what we mean when we say that that's what polygamous is. And so if we don't have marriage license and marriage certificates, we don't really have official records of sealings until February 1846.
Right. And that was by proxy after Joseph's death. So we do have, though, you're saying we do have journals from Heber C. Kimball, Brigham Young, and William Clayton talking about their polygamy, at least giving insight into it. Mm-hmm. And so what I find interesting is all of those things you talked about knowing that Joseph taught it and that he had ceremonies, all of that is much later, in the affidavit starting in 1869
Well, there's
in
contemporary
Utah.
evidence.
There's contemporary evidence that Joseph was teaching marrying inside of eternity, which both he and Hiram denied had anything to do with polygamy. And so I guess what I'm finding interesting is we always say, well, it was illegal. They couldn't have written it in their journals. They couldn't have written anything in it. We know that Joseph was consistently denying it, as was Hiram, and we know like it's really become more important to me, Joseph's statement that for the last 3 years I've hired many very good scribes to follow me around and write down everything I do to
Huh?
prove my innocence, and so he was actively trying to have daily journals be kept that would show his interest, his innocence. And it's interesting to me that we don't have those. Like, we have James Whitehead say that he turned all of that in to the 12. And where has it all gone? Like, we should have several journals. Even the best we could claim is that Joseph was telling them, don't actually write down what I'm doing. But he does say that the reason he had these people keeping his journals was to prove his innocence. And so I'm looking at the difference between Brigham, Heber, and William Clayton had journals talking about their polygamy. We have nothing like that from Joseph, but we have constant and continual denials from him. I find that interesting.
Well, we have
And
denials from
something
the
that
others too. I mean, there's denials from.
we have the strongest
I mean,
denials by far from Joseph. Brigham
that's true.
Brigham and Heber signed their names to Joseph's things, which to me lends credibility to the fact that he was so frustrated by all of the elders going out and saying he was doing this when he wasn't. I think that there's
Well,
that's something we should consider. I also, well, you go ahead and respond, and then I'll.
yeah. Well, I mean, there's some. I mean, like Joseph Seelings wrote a Richards journal, so there's that.
In William Clayton's,
No,
that's
in Joseph's
something.
journal. No, in Joseph's
Well,
journal.
Joseph,
In Joseph
and
Smith's
who
journal.
wrote Joseph Smith's journal?
Well, where are the Richards?
Okay.
So it's Joseph Smith's journal.
So,
Yeah.
but Joseph Smith said the reason he employed scribes to keep his journal was to prove his innocence of polygamy. So it's really strange that he would have Willard Richards keeping a journal for him, recording anything to do with polygamy, when his stated reason for having journals kept was to prove his innocence. So
Yeah, but
I will say this, like yes, from the outset, to believe that Joseph wasn't the originator of polygamy requires you to believe that there was a concerted conspiracy, an intentional effort that continued on into the affidavits, that continued on for decades in Utah to paint him as a polygamist. And we know that Brigham did that with several other things, like the racial ban. They tried to say it came from Joseph when we know that it didn't. We have other cases where this happened. And so I'm acknowledging that to say Joseph wasn't a polygamist is to say there was a conspiracy to paint him as a polygamist. And that's the case that I think, like I was going to say, that's the case that I think has grown for me,
okay.
especially when like getting into the RLDS history. It's interesting to me how we completely disregard and throw out Joseph Smith III. I find that fascinating because Joseph Smith, as the prophet founder, and most likely, I think we can assume that, he probably looked to lineal succession. That was the biblical standard. And,
Yeah.
so it's hard for me to believe that if he had restored this, what the later leaders called it, the highest, holiest principle of the gospel that was necessary for exaltation, that he wouldn't have taught it to his son. We know that Brigham Young wanted his sons to grow up, and Joseph said, at least in my research on Emma, his last words to Emma before he went to Carthage were, "Can you raise up my sons to be men like I am?" And so and I think Joseph Smith III was 11 years old, and he had a strong understanding of who his parents were. So that's really. Like I think that we throw out a lot too easily, and then we overstate a lot and take it without enough credulity. That's been my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's
how it looks to me.
I think that's fair. Yeah, to say that there are all these things that we ought to look at and consider. But I mean, it's really hard to reconcile yeah, to reconcile this outward denial, this outward picture of being anti-polygamy, really for any of them, with what they would have been doing privately. Yeah.
So how do you think about that?
How do I think about what?
The outward denials. Like for me, we have a pattern. We know that Eliza Snow, Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, John Taylor, we have a lot of evidence of them saying what was needful to be said, having the highest
Right.
good being, if we want to call it lying for the Lord, right?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
have that pattern of them doing that. We don't necessarily have that pattern with Joseph Smith unless we find him guilty before we go to the evidence, right? Like if Joseph Smith was telling the truth, that is very plausible. And so anyway, so people become a little less trustworthy when you know that they have lied, right? So we know that all of these leaders have lied. We don't necessarily know that Joseph lied. We
Well,
believe that based on the claims
yeah.
of these people that we know lied. Does that make sense?
It'd be a lot
if they
easier
lied,
if Joseph was still alive in 1852, when everybody.
right?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing.
Absolutely. But when they
And
lied
that's
so
what it
much
comes
about
down to
polygamy,
is we can say, well, we know
yeah,
all these people did because they're still alive in 1852 when the church goes public.
right.
And
You're
so,
right.
I mean,
That's
well, here's a
fair.
good question. So, like, Ewell K. Whitney died in 1850. There's no record of him ever publicly acknowledging polygamy.
Okay.
Do you believe that he was not a polygamist and everything about him was a lie? Yeah,
See, I haven't done enough research to
exactly.
know,
Well,
but
I mean, Ewell K.
what
Whitney died
records
in
do we have?
1850.
And I would want to know
Louisa
what
Beeman
records
died
we
in
have.
1850. I mean, are we going to
Right,
just
but
deny that everything about her being married to Joseph, and then even if
I
you're young, and even the children that she supposedly had and died, that's all made up? I mean, she's
well,
not
I
around
think
to tell
that
us.
we would need to look into the evidence is what I'm
Okay,
saying.
yeah,
If Louisa Beeman was saying they're lying about me, I didn't do this, and making these impassioned pleas of
yeah,
innocence, I think I would consider that at least. And then try to say, okay, is there anything to disprove that? So I'm looking at Joseph's
okay,
impassioned pleas
okay,
and then saying, what is there that can disprove that? And the thing I was going to say is that if the LDS, we know they lied about polygamy, so it's hard to say that we know for certain that they didn't lie about Joseph. If that was the
okay,
connection I was making.
yeah.
But go
So
ahead.
here,
Yeah, that's a good point though, that he wasn't alive when he could have admitted it.
and he's not the only one, really. I mean, there's James Adams. There's a number, like there's any number of people who were involved in polygamy that died before it was publicly known. And so, here, I wanted to. I found this a bit after I did my paper, and I wanted to include it. But this is something. Are you familiar with Lawrence Foster's work on this?
Is he the one that wrote Kingdom? Oh, maybe I don't know. You'll have to tell me. Is
He
he the
wrote.
one?
So okay, so you know about how Daniel Bachman did his research in the 1970s, and his thesis is kind of the beginning of what we consider the modern academic
Because
research.
he found those 1869 affidavits.
He did it. He's kind of one of the modern ones. So Lawrence Foster was doing his research at the same time. He's never been a Mormon of any kind ever, and he's not. He's very sympathetic, and so he did his thesis at the same time too. And they came to a lot of the same conclusions. And he wrote this book. This isn't the first edition. This is Religion and Sexuality. So it's a book that he wrote.
Oh yes, yeah, I do have that.
Yeah, and so he wrote. It's also about the Shakers and about the Oneida group. And so I liked his perspective because when he did his research, he fully considered the RLDS perspective. And he says he says he says this, and I really liked how he put it. And I think he says, well, one may sympathize with the intense hatred of polygamy shown by the reorganized Mormon Church. The popular RLDS position on this issue is historically untenable. Overwhelmingly exists that Joseph Smith not only introduced polygamous beliefs in the Mormon Church, but that he almost certainly engaged in the polygamous practice himself. The evidence includes contemporary letters, diary accounts, and circumstantial evidence from Mormon believers, including a handwritten letter from Joseph. So that's talking about the Whitney letter. Yeah, contemporary manuscripts.
When you say the Whitney letter, just to clarify, are you talking about the letter saying, come and see me, watch out for
Yeah.
Emma, burn this letter? Is it that one? Okay.
So we'll put it in that. Yeah, diary accounts. Okay, I said that printed accounts by Mormon apostates and anti-Mormons who were in a position to know what was happening in Nauvoo, and a large body of retrospective testimony and affidavits by Smith's wives and closest associates. These accounts are supported by statements from most of the early leaders of the reorganization and by the official RLDS paper, the True Latter-day Saints Herald. It says, and it goes on how in the first issue how they had that issue about Joseph being a polygamist. That statement by Isaac Sheen. Then said you're
Which we can get into that. I just did a deep dive into all of that, and I was actually shocked at how weak that's what I'm finding happens again and again and again is we have statements like this. Basically, the science is settled. That's how I always describe it. But then you get into each of these pieces of evidence, and they're not very good. Like that first edition of the Latter-day Saints Herald, even, well, I don't know how much we want to get into the weeds, but you know, researching, he relies on Sheen and Marks, and I think that the Sheen one just needs to be thrown. It's very weak, but even the Marks one, there's a much more plausible way to understand that I think makes a lot more sense.
okay. I'll finish what he says because this is what he says. Is that,
oh, sorry, Kay.
Yeah, it says, despite the wide range of biases represented by these different sources, the degree in which they agree on the basic details of early polygamy is impressive. And I think that's what it is. It's the convergence of the evidence, is where these things converge. It was the biggest thing for me. The allegation.
So, okay.
Yeah, and so that's what I think he says. He says, but the allegation that the testimonies and affidavits which the Utah Church later released to support its position were fraudulent is simply not supported by the evidence. And so I would put it in that. There's one is that there's such a convergence of the evidence that we have. And that the evidence that there was this conspiracy to bring it about, the kind of conspiracy, the degree of conspiracy, that the size of the conspiracy, I don't see the evidence being there for that.
Okay, so let me ask you something about the convergence of the evidence. For example, okay. So with William Marks, he said that Joseph, pulled him aside and said, "I've been deceived," and right, and so that actually doesn't converge at all with all of the Utah evidence, right? And that's one of that was for me that William Marks testimony that he repeats at least 3 times was a really sticking point for me until I realized it really doesn't make sense unless we understand that William Marks misunderstood what Joseph Smith was saying. Joseph Smith, when you read William Marks' account, it becomes clear to me that Joseph Smith was saying, "I've been deceived in the brethren, not I've been deceived in the doctrine of polygamy." And I think he could have cleared that up in a heartbeat if he had lived and understood how William Marks, it's a very easy misunderstanding to make. And it doesn't make sense otherwise because, well, anyway, I talk about it in my episode. But,
but William Marks also said that he saw the revelation.
What did you say?
William Marks also said that he saw the revelation.
Oh, I'd have to see that because there is a lot of, there's so much, like again, we only look at one side of the story because there's so much testimony of the revelation having been changed. And I also,
you want to do a deep dive into the revelation because I think that's a good way to look at the conversion, to get the convergence.
Okay. So, we can, yeah. And I also, well, I also, for me, I came through it, not through the evidence, but for 132 itself. So have you looked at 132, like scripturally, theologically, compared what it says to what Joseph did, compared whether Joseph with any other commandment or revelation from God completely ignored it, disregarded it, disobeyed it. It had no application to what he was really doing, and it had factual errors in it and internal contradictions. Like 132 seems to me to be very different from all of the rest of Joseph's revelations, including the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants repeatedly. And I can't find anything else of Joseph Smith that's like that. So I'm curious if you've looked or considered that part of it.
A lot of that can be very, very subjective if it's consistent.
Well, not. I mean, you can say it's subjective in terms of if you pray about it and get an answer, but we can look at it and say, okay, here are several factual errors in section 132. Such as Isaac, claiming that Isaac was a polygamist in verse 1. Like, there's just one easy one to go to.
What's wrong with that?
Isaac wasn't a polygamist.
It doesn't say either way in Genesis whether he was or not.
It gives us a very detailed account of his marriage and his life and his children. And we know about his love story with Rebecca. We know about their children. We know about the inheritance. We know. So it would be, I compared it to, because it's one of the most beautiful love stories we have in the entire, well, at least the book of Genesis. So it'd be almost like writing Romeo and Juliet and just omitting the fact that Romeo had someone else on the side. It's a bizarre claim to just throw in 132. It just seems like a factual, like just everyone kind of goes, oh yeah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were polygamists without real. There's a high level of biblical illiteracy in 132 that I don't see present
I mean,
anywhere
I don't
else.
know. I mean, you can make the argument too that I mean, Joseph's revelations talk about Moses being translated when the Bible says in a couple places that Moses died and was buried. I mean, Joseph's revelations frequently give more details about biblical figures than what we have in the Bible itself, and in some places maybe even contradict them. But I mean,
Okay,
is that a reason to say that? But even if we go with that, is that a reason to say that it's not historical? I mean,
that what's not historical.
that the revelation is not historical. I mean, that it doesn't match up with things in the Bible. Is that a reason to say it's not historical?
I'm not saying it. I don't. I'm not quite sure what you mean by historical. I don't
That that
believe
Joseph
that
that Joseph
Joseph was
that Joseph
that.
didn't
I
write it.
know. I don't believe that God was the
Okay.
author of 132, and I don't believe that Joseph was the author of
Okay.
132. Maybe there were portions. I think it's very possible that there was a revelation on. We have
Okay.
notes from the High Council that a revelation was read about eternal marriage of some sort, but both Joseph and Hiram said it had nothing to do with polygamy at all. And so I think that that's
Yeah.
possible, but 132 doesn't like I also, like I said, I can't think of another revelation that Joseph received and didn't at least try to live. Like how 132 specifies the rules it specifies about polygamy, our story of Joseph. Like 132 is very explicit that it must be virgins, and
Yeah.
Joseph is marrying other men's wives. That's just another example. There are many examples like that. So I just wondered
Okay.
if you.
I mean that those are. I mean, to me, those aren't reasons to dismiss it historically. To dismiss that Joseph is the one that wrote it. Those may be reasons to say that it was wrong, maybe, or not theological. Those aren't reasons to say
Okay.
that's not. Yeah.
So if we had like I just want to know if we had, say we have like someone saying, "Hey, Edgar Allan Poe wrote this poem," and we all read it and we are like, "This is not nearly the quality of anything else he wrote. It doesn't sound like him. It goes against everything that he had previously written." Wouldn't that be a reason to say we don't think that like that is something that we take into consideration when we're looking at authorship and claims of authorship is it consistent with their style, with the other things they wrote, with the things they previously wrote, right? I think that is a reason to
Well,
consider.
I mean, but again, a lot of that stuff is going to be subjective, and how you see it. A good way to do it. What I would like to see actually is if we did like an actual stylometry analysis on it too, where you can
Yeah,
compare writing
someone's
styles.
done that. Maybe I could find it and link it. So I know it's been done, but maybe not.
So
Maybe
if you're
someone
talking
from the
about
other side needs to do it.
there's the Enid DeBarth study was one that she did in the 60s, and she was doing it based on the then popular but now debunked notion that writing styles are like fingerprints, and um, you can just subjectively go through and pick a bunch of writing styles and know what the person says. She does use a lot of data, but she doesn't really test for statistical significance. I mean, to do a stylometry, if you're to do one now, and there's been things done like that. There's been studies like this done on like the Federalist Papers, for example. And what you do
Right,
is
to see who wrote them.
yeah, uh, you do things like you test certain connecting words, and you have to build a big body of evidence, a big body of sources to compare it to, and you have to test it against a control group, and you have to test it for statistical significance, and they can test within like maybe a 95% confidence that it is or not. And the DeBar study, another interesting one is there's Eleanor Partridge did one too, and she did it on Joseph's writing styles, and she compared it to his writing styles, and she said that it matched really well with his writing style.
Okay. Well,
That's,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
and her main study is about the was about the lectures on faith This is before a lot of the style of mystery studies have been done on the lectures on faith. And she came to the conclusion that it was Sidney Rigdon. But she said that there were limitations on, because she did it sort of the same way that Enid DeBarth did, where she looked at just writing style subjectively, and she came to the conclusion that it was more like Sidney Rigdon's writing than it was Joseph's, the lectures on faith, that is. And
Okay.
objective studies have since proven that she was right.
Okay.
And
Okay,
so,
and for me, I'm not as interested in the stylistic because that does feel a lot more subjective. I'm more, I guess, for me, I'm more talking about how Jacob chapters 2 and 3 talk about women, how woman is treated throughout the Book of Mormon, throughout the Doctrine and Covenants, compared to section 132, how the consistent command to cleave to one wife. It always, like throughout the entire Doctrine and Covenants, it is a very monogamous book of scripture. It's always one man and one wife, even without the section 101 that Joseph did approve to have reprinted, and but throughout the rest of the Doctrine and Covenants, it is always one man and one wife. So 132 is a huge departure theologically and it really contradicts everything that Joseph had previously translated and previously revealed in really massive ways without giving like Joseph, when he brings something forward, there's an explanation, an understanding. It comes with light and knowledge, right? Instead of just like flat out contradicting it and pretending it doesn't exist, or being unfamiliar with it or not dealing with it. It doesn't just it's not just ignorant of it or just contradict it. It elucidates it, is my experience with Joseph, as well as the fact that he tries to live the revelations that he's given. But anyway,
okay.
we can move on. So
Okay, yeah. I mean,
that's the main way that I started coming to it, is just reading, reading Jacob 2, for example, and 132 and going, this is not the same God. Like how God talks about women, his daughters, in Jacob 2 compared to how God talks about daughters in 132, with like one of them, they're complete possessions and their feelings don't matter, and they don't even have feelings. They're just instruments to be used by men, as opposed to Jacob 2. So I find that to be compelling to me. And so I do bring that part of it to the research, but I feel like we all should, to some extent. We should, right? And then I guess my other question is, as I was reading through the Richard Howard paper, I was really struck with him saying how many affidavits the RLDS Church produced in the 1880s and 1890s or 70s and 80s or something. And interestingly, I've never seen those. Like, do you know where those are? Because they have, just like the LDS Church was producing all of the affidavits, the RLDS Church was as well. But for some reason, we just all accept the LDS ones, and we're not even aware of, let alone having studied out or accepting the RLDS affidavits. And that's really interesting to me, because it's my understanding that the RLDS, like the judge actually sided with the RLDS. They actually won that case. The judge found them much more credible. I know it was later overturned on a technicality, but that the same way that Warren Jeff's first conviction
on the polygamy issue, what Judge Phillips decided was that it didn't matter whether Joseph. People get this wrong.
Okay.
What
But didn't he say
that
he did not find the Utah witnesses credible, especially the women?
He did not say that. He never said the Utah
Okay.
witnesses. He did not say that the women that testified there were Joseph Smith. People get this wrong.
Okay.
What he said is, he says is that the question comes up is whether Joseph Smith was a polygamist. He says the respondents, the defendant, which is the Temple Lot Church, said they produced those witnesses that said they were. And he said it would be uncharitable to just say that they gave false testimony. He says, so what he says is, ordinarily we wouldn't just look at you wouldn't just dismiss their testimony. But he says, but in line with the totality of the evidence, he says it would be difficult to escape the conclusion that they were anything more but sports and nest hiding. All right.
But what? Say that again.
That they were but sports and nest hiding is the phrase he uses. And so a lot of people interpret that to mean that he's saying that they were lying. Nest hiding means Nestling has a very specific meaning. That's a reference to the Henry Ward Beecher case. That phrase was made very popular and entered the vernacular in the Henry Ward Beecher case. It means an affair between a religious leader, a secret affair between a religious leader and a member of their congregation, which is what he was found doing. And then he says, and when he says, in light of the totality of the evidence, the conclusion is clear that no such marriages occurred under the laws of the church. So what he concluded is that what mattered for the purposes of that case was which church was following the canonized law that was established at the time Joseph died. And no one was claiming that polygamy was canonized law. They said there was a
Okay.
revelation on it, but that it was, he said what was actually published and officially canonized by conference. And by no account was polygamy done that. And if you read the rest of it, he goes on to say that he lists reasons to think why Joseph Smith was not a polygamist. He lists the denials and the lack of offspring, but he stopped short of saying that shows that he wasn't a polygamist.
Okay,
but we have their testimony. We have their testimony. We have these reasons to think that he wasn't, but ultimately it doesn't matter for the purpose of this case. So that he never says in there that the women were not credible.
Okay.
His reasons for discounting them are because of other evidence that would contradict what they said, but he never says that the testimony that they gave itself was not credible. He never.
So
said
have you read through the testimonies? I assume you have. Do you find like Emily Partridge credible?
I think with Emily Partridge there is an issue because there's the whole issue of the second sealing, and there's issues about her dating that come up, and there's issues about conflict with whether it happened or not, like including in William Clayton's journal. Because William Clayton said that it was going to happen, but it didn't. And so that's a whole issue. Cheryl Bruno has a whole essay on that's going to come out in the same book. So I think with Emily Partridge, I think that there are cases where I think she's overstating some. Melissa Lott, I find to be credible. The thing about
I just want to clarify. So overstating, she is not being honest. Like,
I don't know about that.
Okay, overstating.
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, I think in especially James Whitehead. James Whitehead's testimony is incredibly problematic, but I don't think he's outright lying. A lot of people have said it too. I've wondered, Mike Quinn said James Whitehead straight perjured himself. There's a lot of places where things he says is absolutely contradicted. But then Richard Howard gave a response.
Okay.
Richard Howard gave a response, says, well, he's not perjured himself, but he's an older person. He's listened to RLDS Pometics for many decades. So credibility and truthfulness are two different things. They're not necessarily
right. Okay.
Anybody who's an attorney or anybody that's done this knows that even people when they're telling the truth are going to have credibility issues. There's no testimony that is 100%. It's 100% credible or 100%.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess on the factual truthfulness is objective to a large extent. We can look and say, no, those dates are wrong. No, that, but the credibility is more subjective. Do I feel like this person is trying to be truthful?
Yeah. I mean, there's factors to it.
Okay.
I mean, even there's people that have absolutely no credibility that sometimes are telling the truth. And we know that because when you can tell that because what they say is, supported by other sources, and there's stuff that there's no other way they could have known what they're saying.
Okay.
That's when they say the convergence of evidence. I mean, there's stuff about that, like with John Bennett. I mean, John Bennett he has no credibility. Absolutely not.
Right.
But at the same time, there's stuff where he identifies 5 of Joseph Smith's wives, and in 2 cases, the men that sealed them, that is absolutely supported by other sources.
Right. For me, that is almost like, I know a couple of people that like the, what are the mediums that can go, oh, I'm getting an R. Is there an R in your, you know what I mean? He has 2 letters. He does not have anything like a comprehensive list. Some of them are flat out wrong. And, to me, it's like and we don't know what rumors were going around, what things were being said, and the affidavits were written long after John Bennett, so they would have had access to it. So anyway, so for me, that's not very I don't find that to be compelling that he got 5 of the wives right. I think we have to really stretch it, just like you do with a medium. You have to be wanting them to get it right and kind of helping them along, is how it looks to me.
So with like Louisa Beaman, so with Louisa Beaman, the letters are pretty broad, and he also names Joseph Bates Noble as the person that sealed them. So I mean, you're saying that he just like randomly picked those two, and like what? And
well, he doesn't list Louisa Beaman, right? He lists initials.
They list initials, but initials that line up with hers perfectly. I mean,
right,
right, and she's Joseph Bates Noble's sister-in-law who lives with her.
Right, and so there's obviously there's going to be different perspectives, but I do think it's entirely possible that like I think the fact that the laws got some of the wording from 132 correct isn't that surprising, because people were going around saying Joseph is saying to do this. So they would have already had some of the language there. They would have already been making claims of, I don't find Joseph Bates Noble that credible personally. So he could have very well, he and John Bennett could have they could have very well said,
but I mean, even that, that really, this is what you get into, is like, so these alternative narratives about how this could have happened if it's not true. So Joseph Bates Noble and John Bennett get together like in 1842, and then he continues to go with that throughout the rest of the Utah period.
I don't know, possibly, but I don't know. Yeah,
and for good measure, like Louisa Beaman marries Brigham Young as a pro-life in 1846, and is sealed to Joseph for eternity. And so, I mean, that's what I'm saying. So if there's a conspiracy,
right? No, I hear you.
This is at least what we're going into. Is even if theoretically we're saying that it's not true, it's going to have to involve a very deliberate conspiracy that played the long game insanely well.
Well, I think so. So here's where, like, we can talk about conspiracy in different ways. We know that Brigham was the absolute ruler, right? And we know that they were in a culture of absolute obedience, to the point that women were, their covenants to God were actually to obey their husbands. Okay. And it was if you study the literature at that time, the women's histories that they were explaining, the culture of absolute obedience, right? So, and when you had this kind of, like, we have so many accounts of lying, of like John Taylor saying it was useful to lie. Like, we know that this was happening, absolutely. So I will acknowledge that the Louisa Beaman is maybe one of the harder pieces on that side, but then you weigh it against this other side that's so massive that I'm willing to go, okay, it could have happened these different ways. I'm not exactly sure how, but we have to weigh it against, like really, Joseph had no children, and our explanation for that is that John Bennett was doing abortions. Like, well, I'm a woman. I know how painful
if we want to get into that, sure, we can get into the no children thing too. We talked about this in the debate.
Okay.
Yeah, so I went into this in the debate, and we really just don't know how many sexual encounters he had with these women, or if he was sexually active with all of them. We don't know. And not all sexual encounters result in the birth of a child, and not all conceptions result in the birth of a child either. We really don't know. The assumption is that he's marrying these women so that he can have children with them, but do we know that? That's one of the reasons given for polygamy, but does that mean that he was wanting to do it now, or that it was the only reason? Like I said, Willard Richards doesn't have a child with a poor wife until 1847. So that's.
See, and I, as someone who does believe in, like I believe in God, and I think that God tries to teach us in many ways, and I think it's profoundly important that Emma was pregnant at the time of Joseph's death. Mm-hmm. That is a huge testimony like from God of the truthfulness of marriage, right?
Yeah.
Emma, if you look at, like, I did an episode on Emma that would kind of explain part of my perspective, because we just throw Emma out and ignore everything that she says and everything, and the fact that she was Joseph's wife and the mother of his children. And polygamy just minimizes the importance of marriage in so many ways. It really destroys it. And so, and I also can't think of any other doctrine that, Joseph had a lot of doctrinal innovations.
Mhm.
I can't think of one of them that was bad, that caused this kind of problems. And yet Brigham Young had several doctrinal innovations, and all of them were bad. All of them created a lot of problems, and all of them the church has completely gone away from. And that's another reason that it just doesn't make sense to me, because Joseph didn't introduce like this kind of destructive doctrine that caused so many problems, and
Yeah.
Brigham Young
So
absolutely did
yeah. So
repeatedly.
I think that's the biggest thing for a lot of people is that Joseph being a polygamist, it just doesn't seem to fit with the paradigm of who Joseph Smith is and how he worked. But I mean, but again, for me, this is again, it's like I said, it's the mentality. I think is the biggest difference for what people is. For me, it's the fact that we do have these sources and they converge. And
Okay.
yeah, I think that's what it is. So
So converging meaning like John Bennett and Louisa Beaman and
yeah, and so I mean,
William Bates Noble.
Brigham Young's journal in 1845 refers to Louisa Beaman as Louisa Smith. Um, so there's stuff like that. The fact that
Yeah, and
yeah,
so
I
you
mean,
have to get into the mindset of they were trying to frame him. Do you know what I mean? So I know
so you're
it's
having to at
that's
the same
why
time say that
it's
like
a
so
completely different paradigm.
ostensibly yeah, they're either trying to frame him ostensibly contemporary records are like forged after the fact. Um,
Well, like for example, no one ever called any of Joseph's wives by his last name. None of them ever went by Sister Smith. So it's actually weird that Brigham Young would write Louisa Smith. That's
well,
weird because that
I mean,
never
like,
was. They
well,
didn't
like
take
Melissa,
that's another thing that would be an indication of marriage, is they would take his name, and none of them ever did. Like Todd Compton talks about reading through Eliza Snow's journal and having to figure out who all of the sisters were.
yeah.
None of them were called Sister Smith ever, but he went through and figured out who they all were, and he labels them so and so Smith Young, so and so Smith Kimball. He gives them that last name, but they never took it.
Well,
So Brigham Young, she was never called. Louisa Beaman was never called
that's not the
Sister
only
Smith.
example of that. So like Melissa Lott's in their family Bible, like so Melissa Lott's sealing to Joseph Smith is also it's in their family Bible. So that's another thing that people will argue is
Well, isn't that very cryptic? Isn't that very like not actually? It doesn't say Joseph Smith, and it doesn't say.
it says that her parents were sealed by Joseph and Hiram, and then it says then that same day that they gave her to wife, on the same day that Joseph,
Okay.
and then in a little bit later entry, it refers to her as Melissa Smith.
Okay.
So when she gets married to what's his name, Ira Willis, I don't remember that's his first name. Then she's listed as Melissa Smith, and that's in 1846 or 1845, 1846. She gets married to him, so she's listed there as Melissa Smith.
Okay.
So there's that. But yeah, by and large, they did. So like I said, it's a lot of these things where we have the ceremony and we don't have much else after that.
Well, and even the ceremony, we don't really have. I mean, we have some little indication, but we don't even have a ceremony necessarily. We have someone claiming that there was a secret ceremony that no one else
Yeah.
was aware of, really. So it's very. Anyway, so okay, did you want to dig into like any of you? So I will say this. I know that it sounds like there's this conspiracy, but when we look at it and see it happening again and again, like I have had this. I guess that's why I finally, it has taken years where I'm just like, I'm not even going to worry about Joseph Smith because it's too messy. I can't get into it. What finally kind of pushed me to that side is again and again and again, I would see something that I was like, oh my gosh, this is really bad. Joseph was not only a polygamist, he was awful. And then there's always an answer to it that shows that not only was it not Joseph, but there was a conspiracy. Like, for example, um, just last year, the Peacemaker, is that what it's called? That was printed by
Oh
Joseph
yeah,
Smith.
no,
It
the
says
Peacemaker I would not. Yeah, that's not in it. That's
right,
not evidence I
but
would
I
use.
but I'm telling you, this happens again and again.
Okay.
Somebody put Joseph's name really big on the front of the Peacemaker. I was reading it, going, "This is awful."
Yeah.
And all of the people that want to claim how awful Joseph Smith is use all of these sources. And then you realize Joseph completely disavowed it, said it wasn't him, it was done while he was gone. And so we know that there absolutely was this conspiracy trying
Oh
to
yeah. I mean yeah.
frame him, and it shows up again and again and again. And he, with his own words, is like, hey, I teach everything in public. I don't teach it in secret. Don't listen to anyone, whether they're a prophet or an apostle, if they tell you anything different than the old established laws in the scriptures. Like he is saying again and again and again that he's not doing this. And we know, and everything I find that makes it look like he's doing it, I later find out is part of a conspiracy. So pretty soon you go, okay.
Yeah, I mean, so things like that, but then you see how big this conspiracy would have to be, and how many people like Larry Foster says, people of very divergent, even conflicting biases that are somehow working together. That's where.
Well,
Yeah.
I think that John Bennett was definitely spreading. I think a lot of things were being spread. I think William Marks, it was a misunderstanding. I think, I guess, well, let me ask you, have you read the RLDS affidavits? With all of the work you've done with the RLDS, have you read their affidavits that William...
What are you referring to exactly?
So, Dick Howard talks about all of the affidavits that both the LDS and the RLDS Church created in the late 1800s to prove their side of it. And he doesn't go into them in the paper. He just throws them out. He just says, and that's not good evidence. And so he throws it out and ignores it. But what I find fascinating is he completely agrees with and believes the Utah affidavits, but doesn't bring up, like, I want to find the RLDS affidavits of all of those people.
I'd have to look at that paper again. Like how
okay, I can find it.
When I looked at it too, is that he actually, what I found really compelling about the Richard Howard paper is that he doesn't really go into the Utah evidence at all. I think
right.
That's not really what he gets into. He goes into some of the later ones. I mean, there's affidavits from RLDS members like Ebenezer Robinson who says Joseph Smith was a polygamist that he quotes.
Okay, not in that paper. He doesn't in that paper.
Yeah, he
I just
does.
read it.
He does.
Oh, okay.
He does. Richard Howard, he quotes Ebenezer Robinson quite a bit.
Okay. I'm trying to find the quote. So anyway, so that's what I'm curious about is, have you read, so you haven't seen any of the RLDS affidavits?
I mean, there's affidavits that they had and stuff too. There's Joseph III's memoirs, and I think he got statements from William Smith, his uncle. And that's kind of another thing too, is you see really the deliberate effort that that the RLDS Church goes through. That like with William Smith, Joseph Smith III tells him in a letter, says, "You need to forget everything you know that connects my father to polygamy." Like he tells him that.
That's not exactly the wording. I've read that.
Yeah, he says that, and he tells them, when he gets an affidavit, he tells them, "You need to give me an affidavit that needs to say this." And he goes through that. It's pretty deliberate. The amount of stuff that they go through, I don't really see that as much. And I mean, that's the other thing about the conspiracy angle, is specific evidence for the kind of conspiracy that exists. I don't really see that. And there's several dissenters from Brigham Young circle, people like the Master Lyman, George Watt, Mark Forstcut, that are very intimately connected with them, and they don't expose this conspiracy. Even the ones that don't think Joseph Smith was a polygamist, they don't. So I have a hard time believing that the conspiracy of that magnitude exists. That would have to exist did. And then again, there's also third-party evidence.
So when you talk about how massive the conspiracy would be, are you talking about all of the affidavits? Because
yeah, I mean, how do they get the dates? Where they go? How do they do all that? It's just, I don't.
But see, I don't. So you do think that it's more logical that Joseph was marrying other men's wives um and that he was connect even the Helen Mar Kimball, she like preaches how much sacrifice there was, and I think it's because this she was living in a time when sacrifice was honored, so she was
Yeah.
talking about the
Okay.
sacrifice. But the theological question of Heber C. Kimball using his 14-year-old daughter as a means to serve his own purposes because he wanted to be connected to Joseph Smith. Um, like I know Brian Hales refers to them as dynastic sealings, but to me
Huh?
it's like, can't we all just agree that that's bad? And that's and so Helen is convinced that that's the correct theology. It doesn't agree with anything that Brigham Young and Heber Kimball and Orson Pratt were teaching. It doesn't agree with anything we have continued to go on. So theologically, there's just there's nothing to
Yeah,
it that
and
makes any
again, like
sense.
that's bad. I mean, just that's bad. Does that mean it didn't happen? I mean, because it's bad.
Well, no, but I guess our idea, like as active LDS people looking at the narrative, there are so
Okay.
many different angles we could take.
Yeah.
But and so it's a different discussion to be had with like anti-Mormon or people that have left the church over Joseph's polygamy and really just dislike him and want to find all the bad in him. There are different questions that we can ask. I think that the theological questions are very relevant and important for people who still have connection to the church, who still
And I think
believe.
they are, but if we're
And
looking at this just subjectively, I mean, just because it's bad, because we don't, because certain aspects of this rub us the wrong way, does that mean that they didn't happen? I mean,
no, no, that's not what I'm saying though. That yeah, that's
or
not.
that the theology doesn't match up. I mean, does that mean that it's not something that people did? I mean, I don't see that as being the case, and so
Okay. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I guess what I kind of lost my train of thought there. What I
okay.
was saying is I think that there were absolutely the conditions were perfectly set for people to have their highest moral good being saying what they needed to say to prove to for the sake of the kingdom. We need to protect the kingdom. We need to defend the kingdom. We need to um we like God needs you to do this.
Okay.
To me
Yeah.
that is not a stretch at all in as far as the Utah affidavits. And in fact, we've found several of them that are like explicitly lying. Like we can objectively say this is not true, this is a lie. We can find several of them that do that, just like how Brigham Young was making all of these claims about Emma and he would always saying Joseph taught me this in secret, Joseph taught me this in secret, where actually Hiram was Joseph's bigger confidant, and even Emma was Joseph's bigger confidant. Brigham spent most of his time on missions. So there is this pattern of dishonesty that I think should be taken
Oh,
into
yeah, and
account.
I think some of that can be taken into account. And but let's also keep in mind too is that I mean, just because something happened doesn't mean that people can't also lie about it and also can't make up aspects about it too. I
Overstate
mean,
it. Okay.
yeah. I mean, if you look
Mm-hmm.
at that too, I mean, if you look at the flip side of that too, I mean, there's stuff that William Smith very clearly lies about when he's talking about Joseph Smith not being a polygamist, and there's stuff that James Whitehead clearly lies or clearly is wrong about.
Well, so that's my question, because you like it seems to me that you discern, you can correct me, but kind of discern when they're lying and when they're being honest based on your conclusion that Joseph was a polygamist. So you just kind of automatically say when they're saying Joseph wasn't a polygamist, they're lying. When do you know what I mean? Maybe you could help me
Oh well,
understand.
okay. If I want to well to clarify that too. So in the cases of so James Whitehead, I mean James Whitehead, there's a point where he tells RLDS, he tells William W. Blair, the RLDS apostle, yes, Joseph Smith was a polygamist, and would put wives into his hand, and so which is
Okay.
completely contradictory to his temple at that position. He
Okay.
claims that he was Joseph Smith's private secretary and that William Clayton had been dismissed. That's not supported by anything else, and it's contradicted by many other things.
What is it contradicted by? Because that was important to me.
Well,
Like I found that interesting. So maybe
I mean,
I.
there's the, I think it's the there's the well, I think it's because he says it's when is it? He says it's early 1843 that William Clayton's dismissed.
So
I
the
mean,
only thing
even
that contradicts it is the only thing I found that contradicts it is Clayton's 1874 affidavit when he's telling the story of.
there's numerous papers in William Clayton's handwriting that date well after that. There's the fact that the Times and Seasons has an article that's well after early 1843 that talks about William Clayton. The talk says Willard Richards is his private secretary, and William Clayton is the one that fills in when Willard Richards is out. So there's that. There's the fact that William Clayton is doing work for Joseph Smith, and there's the William Clayton v. Rhodes case that was in the Carthage courthouse well into 1844. So, what's supporting evidence? There's not really any supporting evidence that James Whitehead was a private secretary. Does he have any papers or letters that show that? I mean, he doesn't claim that until the 1890s.
Okay, in the Temple Lot case.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, does he make that claim before
Well, I
then?
looked it up. So the Joseph Smith papers, I looked up his biography, and it did list him as
He was a clerk.
a
Yeah,
private
he was a
secretary.
clerk. There are a few papers in his handwriting, but he was a clerk. But he's saying that that William Clayton had been dismissed, and he was Joseph Smith's like main secretary. There's just not a lot that backs that up. And so he says that. So there's things like I mean there's a bunch of things like that. He says that he didn't follow Brigham Young into one of Porter's when it's documented that he did.
That he didn't what? Say that again.
That he did follow Brigham Young and did relocate to Warner Porter's, and he was excommunicated,
Okay.
and then he
By
leaves
Brigham
after he's
Young.
excommunicated. So I mean, there's a whole lot of things about James Whitehead's testimony. So, but I mean, I wouldn't look to that and say that because we can say that James Whitehead and William Smith have these issues. William Smith in the Temple Lot case swears that he did not have polygamy in the church that he presided over in the 1840s when he totally did. And
Yeah,
he never
I know
did.
William Smith is messy. Yeah, he's
Yeah,
problematic.
yeah. He overstates a lot of these things. At one point, he says that he never heard about polygamy being practiced before Joseph died. And then in another statement, he says that he overheard Joseph telling Emma that the 12 apostles are practicing polygamy in secret. And those are contradictory. And so, because I mean, those are both individuals that I don't see have a lot of credibility. But I wouldn't say like Emma Smith, we should throw out what she says on that basis. Because those two guys who are RLDS members, who are caught with these things, and we know that there's a big culture within the RLDS church to try and prove Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist. We know that's true. I mean,
Well, I think it's unfair to a lot of that stuff from William Smith came before he was RLDS, and then he was kicked out of the Strangite movement. He was kicked out. He had to
yeah, some of
beg
it
to be
does, but
let
the
into
stuff
the
I mentioned is
RLDS.
not from after. It comes when he's very much within the RLDS church. I mean, there are
Oh,
things that he
okay.
does, yeah. And he's not entirely
Some,
consistent about that either.
okay.
Yeah, so
Okay. So,
so
and then we could do the same thing on the other side. Like, do you find William Clayton's affidavit credible? Because to me, I find it quite
partially,
incredible.
I think there's definitely parts about the story that I don't find to be entirely credible. Like I said, I mean, it would be wrong to say that in order to find Joseph Smith to be a polygamist, that we need to find all the later accounts to be absolutely 100% consistent and credible. That there's not any overstating. That there's not. Say somebody does show up and does lie about being his wife. Does that mean that the other people that are lying too? If somebody lies about being
Well,
an
I mean, so
yeah,
I'm hearing kind of a double standard so
okay,
really, no, I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Um,
Your thought. Yeah,
did I interrupt you?
no, go ahead.
I'll let you finish. Oh, just William Clayton's affidavit. He makes claims that I don't think are like even point saying that Hiram said in
Oh yeah, the
I'm
higher
losing
master of
the
the Urim and Thummim, for example. I don't think that probably didn't happen.
Right.
I don't
Also,
think
that
that happened.
Hiram
Yeah.
said, if you write it, I can convince Emma, when, according to the Partridge sisters, Emma had already approved their marriage, had already, like, like, according to some of the cases, she had already known about it and had already participated. And then it's after that that they're saying, no, if you can teach it to Emma, I know that she'll understand. Like, there are a lot of things, many things. And then William Clayton saying that he, he was told that he will write any further revelations, which is really convenient because that's the only revelation that Joseph, that, that he wrote, that he claimed that Joseph had, and
Well,
that
I
he
think
said
section
that Joseph
129 is
taught him.
in section 129. I think is the earliest manuscript we have of that in William Blake's handwriting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's but so yeah. I mean, I think that there are. I mean, it's like yeah. I think a lot of Brigham Young statements about how he told Hiram about how that is. I think there's a lot of stuff in there where he's laying it on a little bit thicker than it is, and I think that that goes both ways. And that, but
Okay, I can buy that.
that's the nature of later recollections. And later
Right.
recollections always have issues with that kind of thing. But to throw all of them out entirely because they might have some of that, that's where I
Well,
understand
yeah,
it.
I think it's a question of what we're throwing out entirely, right? Because I feel like in order to claim that all of the like what we do in our polygamy narrative is we claim that all of the Utah stories are true and we throw everything else out.
We claim all the
That's
Utah stories are true.
Well, kind of like when we list Joseph's wives, I mean, when we, like, our historical narrative has been to this point that, that everything that was said in these affidavits, like that's our list of Joseph's wives. That's our list of what Joseph was doing. We believe the polyandry. We believe the teenage brides. We believe, we basically don't question those things very much. We absolutely believe William Clayton's account, hook, line, and sinker, even though it seems to me that 132 came kind of out of the blue magically in 1852. It was locked in Brigham's desk, and I know that we can say that Kingsbury
Well,
and in William Clayton's account. Affidavit, he says who transcribed it and how that happened, but he wasn't there. He wasn't watching it. That wouldn't be like he was just sharing the same version that everybody was saying. Does that make? And then anyway, sorry, go ahead.
I mean,
I'm
I don't think it's the case that like say academic historians accept all details of the stories 100%. I mean, that's been the case when I've read things. They'll say this is probably an exaggeration. I think that that is the
right.
case. And so, yeah, I don't
I
think there
guess
needs to be.
I should say that more carefully. It feels like the assumption is these things are true. We're going to accept them unless there is some specific objective reason that we need to throw something out.
Okay,
But we,
that's fair. That's fair, and I think that's because it's again, if we think that there's enough convergence of evidence to say that Joseph Smith wasn't polygamous, then that makes these later accounts more credible, unless there's reason not to. I think that's fair. Um,
okay.
yeah. So
So do you feel like people are troubled enough by the fact that we do know about how dishonest, how many how many lies we've already exposed in the Utah period and affidavits and claims? Like, should that not
so
cast a little more
elaborate
doubt?
elaborate on that. What do you mean? So many lies?
Well, I mean, we have a clear record of the Utah leaders lying, like
Okay.
I'm not going to think of all of them off the top of my head, but one example is Sylvia Sessions Lyon. Josephine Lyon was we knew for sure that she was Joseph's child. It was said forever. It was on her deathbed. She wouldn't have lied about it. That if that DNA evidence had come out conclusive, that would have kind of been a done deal for most people. It would have been like, okay, he had a child with,
Okay.
the fact that she was lying about it should be a bigger deal. It should, tip the scale to the
I
other
don't
direction more than it did.
I don't know that we can say she was lying.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, she could have said you could be Joseph's child. It was lying to say you are Joseph's child.
Here's the text of that. So this is the Josephine Fisher gives this affidavit, February 24th, 1915. And so right there from the bat, we have an issue because is this Sylvia Sessions line or this Sylvia Sessions? This isn't. This is Josephine. This is so right off the bat. This is secondhand.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, this is secondhand, and it is 33 years after the fact, after this mother told her. So right off the bat, we have that issue. Okay, and so this is Josephine telling the story. She says, just prior to my mother's death, 1882, she called me by her bedside and told me the days never forgotten the memory. Okay, she decided to tell me something she had kept an entire secret from me and others, but not until what she now desired to communicate. She told me, this is interesting. She told me that I was the daughter of the prophet Joseph Smith. She, having been sealed to the prophet at the time her husband, Mr. Lyon, was out of fellowship with the church. Okay, so yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. So is she the daughter of Joseph Smith? Does that mean that Sylvia, she's with Joseph Smith and not Windsor Lyon because Windsor's out of fellowship with the church at the time, that at the time of her conception? Does that mean that she's Joseph Smith's daughter because because Windsor Lyon was out of fellowship with the church at the time? It's tough to say. One of the things Brian Hales did some good research on this. They said that he found a bunch of other documents from the family at about this time, about like the 1950, where it refers to some of their relatives that couldn't have been Joseph's biological children because they were born too late. They're as being his children, and so it's clear that they're not meaning in the biological sense that they're his children. But at the same time, there's a lot to go on here because she says that she didn't want to make her statement public because it might have caused unpleasant curiosity. So if she's saying that she's her child, that she's Joseph's child because she's sealed to Joseph, I don't know if that would cause an outcry. But there's just a lot going on here, and it's really hard to parse out.
Sure. I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
is
I
it
saw one. I saw a blessing given to one of Josephine's nieces, whose mother was born years after Joseph died. That says, "You're the last born grandchild of Joseph Smith," and it's from around this
so
time.
it okay. So is it fair to say though that this was seen very much as proof of Joseph's polygamy because he
That
had a
yeah,
child and
that
Josephine?
historians use this as that historians took it as a fact.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, but then what's the conclusion based on that? The historians took this as a fact and they were wrong. The historians were wrong. That means that historians were wrong about something? It doesn't mean that the
No,
sources themselves.
it means that we have a bias
Okay.
toward believing claims of Joseph's polygamy, and and we accept them, and then because everything you said, this is problematic, it's secondhand, it's late. That's
Yeah.
true of pretty much everything. That's kind of the
So
story of
are
the
you saying that's
evidence.
the type of thing that historians should have looked at and pointed out before the DNA evidence came out?
Well, no, I guess all I'm saying is I think it's okay to be a little bit hesitant to just. I think that it does show the bias to say Joseph was a polygamist. Anything that is evidence of Joseph's polygamy, we accept. Anything that doesn't show that isn't evidence of that, we are very skeptical of, or we ignore it, or we downplay and minimize it. I think that that bias is very present, and so now that we know that that Josephine was not Joseph's child. Now we get in and try to go, okay, it could be for all of these different reasons. But until we knew that for sure, it was like slam dunk evidence of Joseph's polygamy. That's how it was considered. That's how it was used,
Yeah, a lot of
like in my
historians did
experience.
talk about it in that sense. Yeah, you're right. That is true. And okay, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think we can come to an agreement there. That I think that this does show that maybe we have been a bit too eager to accept some of these.
Okay.
Yeah,
And I will acknowledge also, yeah, there are tricky things on the other side. William Clayton's journal is tricky. I had an interesting conversation with some possible solutions about that. And John Bennett, while I don't think it's a slam dunk, it is it is something that has to be explained. And so I guess though that I think, like I do think it's okay to say, hey, you know what, even if and also even if people believe some of these things, like that Joseph read a revelation on sealing in some way or eternal marriage in some way, which it seems clear he did, does that necessarily mean that all of this is true, which is kind of where we want to go with it? Like, I think that still, even after the Josephine Lyons came out, what I hear still is, well, she was sleeping with both men. That's still the most
That's a
common
possibility.
explanation I hear.
That is a
And
possibility.
so that feels
Or
like
in succession.
huge bias. Or what did you say?
Or just like one in succession, right? I mean, there's a lot of possibilities. Yeah.
Yeah. And so anyway, and that's why I wanted to like for me, it's like we need to be a little more, we need to be, and I appreciate you for this because I do feel like you're respectful to people that are skeptical of Joseph's polygamy, but a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, you're a flat earther. And I don't think I don't
Well,
think this
and to be
discussion should be
fair,
in
a lot of
that.
historians do acknowledge this kind of thing. I mean, Brian Hale says this in quite a few of his statements too. He says like, look, we're trying to come up with definite answers, like was Joseph Smith sexually active with these polyamorous wives, and we're trying to base this on really evidence that when our evidentiary body, we're trying to come up with very definite answers to these things when our evidentiary body is not great. I mean, that's
Yeah.
yeah. I mean,
But
so
I feel
he
like
acknowledges
Brian
that too.
Hales is, well, I feel like he's firmly settled here and he'll have a little details that he'll be willing to discuss. But we're over here and he does not, he is very set
Well,
in his
and I
position.
mean, if you're wanting to really say the whole thing, that Joseph wasn't a polygamist at all. I mean, again, this is where I say I think the
Or
convergence
was he was
body
he
of
the
the
author of
evidence.
132? Oh, sorry. That's my
Oh,
biggest
I,
question. What?
yeah. Do you let's see? I don't know how much more we want to go into this, but I think going into the deep dive into 132 and the historical documents on that, I think would be a good place to go.
Good. Maybe we can do that for our last bit because we have talked for a while. I hope people are still
Okay.
finding this interesting. I am.
Okay. So, if we look in um, I don't know if I want to go over all the sources that talk about the revelation, but there's a few. So the first ones that we have are going to be private documents about the revelation. There's Joseph Smith's journal that on the date of the revelation, July 12th,
Can I
1843.
clarify something as we get into these? All of these could be talking about something was read in the High Council meeting, right? But it doesn't necessarily
Well,
specify
we'll get into
because,
that. So Joseph's
okay,
journal just says that that he wrote a revelation that it's in the presence of fireman William Clayton. That's all it says in Joseph's journal. William Clayton's journal says that it's about polygamy and it's about the ancient patriarchs and polygamy. He wrote a revelation on it for Joseph. This
yeah,
is
it's
one
there
of
now.
Paul Hanson's things that he found, and this is a letter that Jacob Scott wrote in January 5th, 1844. Paul Hanson, he was the president of the RLDS Forum of the 12. He was looking for any evidence related to Joseph Smith's polygamy, and he got this from Jacob Scott's grandkids who were members of the RLDS Church. He verified the postmark and he verified the date. And he says several relations of great utility and uncommon interest have been communicated to Joseph and the church. But where you all are, he's writing this to his relatives in, I think it's Ohio, you cannot obey them. One is that all marriage contracts and covenants are to be everlasting. That is, that the parties that belong to the church and will obey the will of God in their relationship to another are to be married for both time and eternity. And in this respect, those whose partners are dead before the revelation was given to the church, they have the privilege to be married to their deceased husbands or wives, as the case may be, for eternity. And if it is to be a man who desires to be married for his deceased wife, a sister in the church may stand as proxy, as a representative of the deceased, in attending to the marriage of the ceremony. Or in such is the case of the widow who desires to be joined in an everlasting covenant to her dead husband. And if they are not thus married for eternity, they must remain in a state of celibacy and be as angels, ministering spirits, or servants to be married to all eternity, and can never rise to a greater degree of glory. And many of the members of the church who have already been availed themselves of this privilege have been married to the deceased partners. In some cases, where a man has been married to 2 or 3 wives and they are dead, he's been married to them all. And he goes on a bit about that too. And he says how he wants to be married to his deceased wife and to his current wife. And so that's a document that's dated January 5th, 1844.
Yeah, I believe Richard Howard includes that in his
He
paper.
does.
That's one that I read. Uh-huh.
He does, because that's one of the ones that Paul Hansen found and was part of the
Right.
RLDS archives. And so there's a lot in there that's in section 132.
I would say it actually is not very consistent with 132 at all in most ways.
But
But
it's not.
I don't think so, because that's talking about sealing with your deceased spouse, and
Uh-huh.
it's equal. It mentions both men and women. It's not anything about 132 about restoring, about taking 10 virgins and about the, there are so many
But there's
portions
another
of that
part in
like
here.
that.
There's
Okay,
another part in here. I finished sharing
yeah,
my screen. Maybe I'll pull it back up.
that's okay. You can just read it to us. You don't have
Okay,
to share again if you don't want.
he says, there are many things connected with this subject which I am not at liberty to communicate with you where
Okay,
you are living, which would make this step plainer to the minds more satisfaction. So it says there's a lot more to this that I'm not at liberty to tell you.
okay,
And interesting enough, when Paul Hansen got that letter from his grandson, they said that there were actually more letters that went into more detail about spiritual life doctrine that they were directed to destroy by leaders of the RLDS Church.
oh, okay,
Yeah, Paul Hansen has that in his notes.
okay.
So that there were later records that there were later letters by this gentleman about that.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah. So there's see, I don't have it up here, but there's another one. Jacob Vadrine did another video just recently where he goes through a lot of these, where there's Franklin Richards' account book that he has about the High Council, and there's one where he says where he meets with Hiram, and it's in August 1843. And that's where he says that Hiram says that the doctrine of the Levirate marriage needs to be is going to be restored. So that's where a man
That's
marries
his
his
dead brother's wife.
his dead
Yeah.
brother's wife, which is very
Is
possibly
that
what Joseph did with Don Carlos's widow Agnes Colberth. And so there's that, and so it's in August, and that and some interesting stuff that happens is it's in the next meeting that the High Council has after August 12th is September 1st, and that's when Austin Coles brings charges against George J. Adams related to him preaching polygamy. George J. Adams had previously had his license taken away for charges regarding adultery and slander, which, and according to some accounts, about teaching spiritual life doctrine. And Joseph gives him his license back, and it publishes that in June 1843, after Elder Adams gives testimony against Benjamin Winchester in the case. And just after that, so he reinstates him after that. Joseph reinstates him, and so then Austin Coles brings the same charges against George J. Adams on September 1st, 1843, after the Revelation's been written. And the High Council exonerates him, or it doesn't drops the charges against him, finds him not guilty. And then the next meeting is they publish the thing saying that Elder Adams has his license, and then it's later that month that Austin Coles resigns from the High Council. He resigns as second counselor in the Nauvoo State Presidency. And so he's the one that gives the affidavit in the expositor, where he says that there was the revelation that Hiram read last summer to the High Council. And he says that it's in 2 parts. One part is about eternal marriage. It says that if 2 people are married and they're sealed up to eternal life, and they're sealed up forever unless they commit murder. And then it says the second part is about is about the ancient patriarchs having many wives and concubines, and also is about plural marriage. So a good summary of Section 132. And then, of course, it has William and Jane Law's affidavits in them as well.
Okay. So as far as the story of Hiram asking Joseph to get the Urim and Thummim, and then
Yeah,
getting the revelation, then and letting and then Joseph reading that in that meeting.
Hiram reads it in the
I guess what Hiram reading it in the meeting.
yeah.
So, does it make sense to you that they would have been doing this in secret, being married to all of these people, without ever having written the revelation? Like, what was it they were teaching from, if they hadn't
I
written a
think it is. I
revelation
mean, they did
before?
baptism of the dead
And,
for the dead before they had a written revelation on it.
okay, and so what would lead Hiram to read it at that point when they already were living it, and when they were already having so much hostility and denying it all the time? They had already been excommunicating people. They were denying it constantly and living it. So why would they at that point put themselves in that much danger um, to read
To read it to the High
132?
Council. I think it is Hiram believes that if people know that it's about that there's a revelation for it, he believes people will come around.
Based on William
I
Clayton's
think he does.
affidavit?
I mean, that's what Ebenezer Robinson says. When he says it too. He says, "Yeah, Hiram approached me and my wife. This is an RLDS member who's not a polygamist, who's not an apostate." He says, "Yeah, that's what Hiram said." He says that he didn't believe it until he had. This is a recurring theme that's stated in a lot of things. That's what Ebenezer Robinson says. It says Hiram says, "I didn't believe it until I knew it came by revelation."
Well, okay, because Hiram. Okay, how did Hiram know what came by revelation before the revelation was written, and then what
There's an
like?
equivocation on that. So there's knowing that
Okay,
Joseph's had a revelation on it, and then there's writing a revelation, right? So you can have a
right.
revelation. I mean, you can
But
have
we claim that Joseph got the revelation as early as 1831 or 1833. That's a
when you say that
long time.
when you say the
That's what Brian
revelation.
Hales says, because they try to explain Fanny Alger. They want to claim that Fanny Alger was a wife, which I think is another evidence of just the goofiness of this. And we probably need to wrap this up soon. But this is why
Yeah,
I think it gets so problematic, is because like trying to fit the pieces all together just gets really
trying to do that.
strange.
But I mean, I think, well, to say that Joseph has a revelation on polygamy doesn't mean that he has the revelation that's written in July 1843 on it. I mean,
Although
just like
that's what William Clayton is claiming. He says that he has it memorized. He has it perfectly memorized,
he does
and
say
he
he
can
has it
recite
perfectly
it. And yet,
memorized, but he can
and
also,
then he has him read it back to him to make sure it
yeah,
was the perfect. But
sure.
then it's claimed that he's had it a long time ago. But it speaks to Emma of things they claim were happening that very day. Also, Joseph is so protective of Emma. Why in the world would he have such harsh things said about her? Read in the High Council, like a lot of things seem. Anyway, sorry.
Well,
You
Joseph can
go ahead.
have
I'll let you get the
revelations.
last word.
He can have revelations, and he can have revelations and add to them. That was something he did. Have revelations and add to them later.
Okay.
I mean, that's what Jeremiah does in the in the Old Testament. He has revelations and then adds to them later. I mean,
Yeah, but it's
and
just that
even this.
it's claimed that he's not receiving a revelation at that point, that he's reciting a previously received and memorized revelation. That's what the whole story is framed
Well, I mean,
as.
and that's what, and
That's
maybe William Clayton's right about that. That's something that he had, and then he's adding more to it. But maybe I don't know. I mean, again, do we is William Clayton's later recollection supposed to be entirely accurate?
right. Well, this is
So
why it's so right. This is why it's so tricky, because we all basically what this comes down to is, what do you prioritize? What do you believe? What do you question? Because there's contradiction all throughout it. It seems to me.
okay,
I know that there are areas of divergence, and I mean convergence, but there are also a lot of areas of divergence. And
so
I would say there are areas of that happens on both sides of the discussion.
let's take a look at
But
what Joseph and Hiram say to the High Council, to the City Council. This is from the Nauvoo neighbor. They meet a couple of times after the expulsion comes out. On June 8th, Hiram refers to the revelation read to the High Council of the Church, which has caused so much talk about a multiplicity of wives. That said revelation was an answer to a question concerning things which transpired in the former days and has no reference to the present time. So right there, he's saying that there's a revelation, but it was just in reference to the former days.
Okay.
Doesn't have any relevance today, as Hiram says there. And he confirms that the revelation that what Austin Cullis says is true, that there was a revelation read to the High Council. So he confirms that that's true. Joseph says in the morning on June 10th, he says, they make it a criminality for man to have a wife on earth while he has one in heaven, according to the keys of the priesthood. So this again goes to the idea of he's confirmed that there is one about sealing, that you can be married to a wife on earth while also having one in heaven, that you're sealed to.
Which would make sense with Hiram's situation because that was his
Absolutely.
situation. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And then he read a statement of William Law's expositor where the truth of God is transformed to light concerning this. He then read several statements by Austin Coles and the expositor concerning a private interview and said that he never had a private conversation with Austin Coles on these subjects, which is interesting because Austin Coles never said that they had a private conversation on this subject. He said that Hiram read it to the High Council. He never said that he had a private conversation with Joseph about it. And that he preached from the stand, showing the ancient order of days having nothing to do with the present time. So he says that he preached from the stand. So again, and then that afternoon, then Hiram says that the falsehood of Austin Coles and the expositor in relation to the revelation referred to, that is a reference to the former days, not a present time, is related by Coles. So again, he's saying what Austin Coles got wrong was that this revelation is relevant to the modern day. So he's saying it was about polygamy, but it's just about the former times. And then Joseph says that he never preached the revelation in private as he had in public and had not taught it to the anointed church in private, which statement many confirmed. Okay, so he says he never preached the revelation in private. But then again, Hiram said earlier that it was read to the High Council.
Well, but Joseph said he never preached it in private, and all of these affidavits say that he was teaching it in private years and years before this.
Well, 2 years, yeah. But yeah, and he says that.
Well, I mean, if we want to make Fanny Alger a wife, which Eliza Snow
Yeah.
claims and which Brian Hales claims.
Right, and he goes on, and then he confirms some of the things that are in front there too. That on according to the passage concerning the resurrection, concerning they neither marry nor are given in marriage. And he received from answer that all men in this life must marry in view of eternity. Otherwise, they remain as angels and be seen in heaven, which is the amount the revelation referred to. Okay, so that's what he says. He says that's the subject of the revelation. It's about eternal marriage. And so there's a lot of things in there that do confirm what's read that we do have in 132. And then there's some things that, and he says the amount of the revelation. So these things might be seem to contradict a bit. They might be reconcilable. How Hiram says that the revelation was about polygamy, it just doesn't pertain to the modern day. And then Joseph says, well, the revelation was about eternal marriage. And he says something that actually does seem like it's relevant to the present day.
To me, reading Hiram's sermon that he gave, I won't remember the date, but he gave it, he asked. Okay, and he, I think he sheds more light on this, reading that in the context of this, this never says anything about polygamy. Actually, like you're saying, they read a revelation about polygamy, but it just says that they read a revelation about the former times and about marriage, and and then Hiram Smith gives that sermon, and he very explicitly is like, polygamy is awful. Everyone should have their nose wrung who's talking about polygamy. So I think that does shed more light on, to me, this is actually evidence of that they weren't doing what it's claimed that they were doing. And it also talks about,
right?
And it talks about all of the elders going around and saying this, like Joseph is getting reports every 10 minutes from the elders saying, how many wives can I, like asking basically what Heber and Brigham and William Clayton and Orson Pratt later claimed, and Joseph and Hiram are very much denying it. So anyway, we've got to wrap it up. So go ahead, make your last, because I think it's important to get into this.
Wrap it up. It's getting close. But one of my issues with this is that nobody really backs up this story. None of the High Council members do, they don't publish the revelation now, which I think they would have had every reason to. And this is a special circular that went out in the Novel Neighbor. They're trying to discredit the expositor. That would have been a good way to do it. But you have William Marks, who's the president of the Nauvoo stake, who's later the first council on the RLDS First Presidency, who's never an apostate, who's never a polygamist, and he says um, he was there when Hiram read the revelation on plural marriage to the High Council. He says it was about polygamy. He confirms Austin Cole's side of the story. And then you also have Zenas Gurley Jr., who goes to see Leonard Sobey, who is the other member of the High Council who doesn't go with Brigham Young, who also confirms it was about polygamy, and it was the same revelation that the Utah Church publishes. Nobody else backs it. Not even Emma backs up this story.
Yeah, and Zenas Gurley is third hand, like Joseph Smith the third doesn't give him much credit, that wasn't the third hand account, but I hear you. So, okay. So the question that you're saying, which I think is valid, is if it was just about this, why didn't they go ahead and publish it to?
Why don't they publish it? Why isn't there more? Why isn't there more support for that being the case? There's this revelation.
Right.
I mean, I don't.
Yeah. And I hear you. I would counter on the other side, like if it was the revelation that became 132, there's a lot more scandalous stuff in there that I think they could have been talking about, like the things said about Emma and the threats of destruction. There are a lot of other things that I think would have come
Jane Law
up.
does mention that. She does mention that.
Not about Emma. I don't think she mentions about Emma. Right. Yeah. Right. And so anyway, okay. I really appreciate how much time you've given me. And I know that
a lot of other things you could have gone over, and
I know you have so much more, and I really appreciate you engaging with me, because I know when I first asked you to come on, it was before I had sort of I was much I'm a little bit more of a skeptic. I'm a lot more of a skeptic now than I was when I first invited you on. So I hadn't intended to. Anyway, I really appreciate you is what I'm trying to say, and I hope I didn't push too hard. I really like you sharing your.
I wouldn't want you to just not push back on me if you disagree with me. I mean, I wouldn't want to do that. But
yeah. And then what I'm hoping that people will do is really recognize this is complicated and it takes a lot of care. And really, it might just be like trying to prove the truthfulness of anything, where ultimately we just have to, go with our personal answer we get with the best research we can do and the best information we can get.
Oh, but I mean, it definitely is a complicated subject, for sure.
So, okay, yep. And obviously we settle on different sides of it, but obviously, maybe that's right, because we prioritize different parts of it. I would like someone to help me understand how 132 is consistent with Joseph Smith. That's pretty big one to me. So, and you would like someone to help you understand why there's so much convergence in all of the different sources. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, any last words, Mark?
No, not really. A lot more to go into on that, but I think we covered some ground.
Yeah, well, and you know what? I think that maybe I would say tell everyone we can look for Mark's chapter in his book that's coming out. That sounds really interesting, and continue to engage, because I do know that you have a lot of knowledge and depth and information on this. So I think it will be very valuable to continue to discuss. And it's not an easy topic to get to the bottom of. So
all right.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Oh, well, you have a good night, Michelle.
You too. I'll talk to you later. Thank you for sticking with us. I hope that you found this worthwhile and that there were some good insights that you gained. I'm sure there were many times that you were also frustrated. And so I would love the conversation to continue in the comments. Any things you feel like we missed or we didn't go deep enough into, or I just think it's really valuable to get get the most information that we can from the most voices possible so that we can really dig in and try to figure this thing out. So anyway, I definitely appreciate Mark coming. I wasn't convinced. To me, I'm always surprised by sort of the lack of evidence and the weakness of evidence that people consider very certain. So I thought it was a useful discussion, though, and I really do appreciate him coming on. Next week, we will continue our investigation of Joseph, but from the other side, I'll have the chance to talk to Jeremy Hoop. And so I hope that you will stick around for that. And going forward, we're going to continue to look at Joseph, but we're also going to continue to look at other things. We have some other exciting episodes planned. So thank you for joining us. I hope you will stick with us going forward. I will see you next time.